The night was supposed to be simple, a sleepover among old friends in a familiar house. But as the clock struck midnight, something shifted. The house, once a place of comfort, now feels oppressive, haunted by whispers that echo from the walls. Rachel and her friends are caught in a terrifying reality they can't explain. The air grows thick, the shadows longer, and a sinister force, trapped within the house, begins to reveal itself. Panic rises as they realize that something ancient and malevolent has been waiting for them. And now it won't let them leave. The friends had gathered at Rachel's house for what was supposed to be just another typical sleepover. They'd been best friends for years, ever since high school, and though they were in their 20s now, some traditions never changed. The plan was simple: pizza, snacks, some drinks, and staying up all night watching horror movies. It was meant to be a fun, casual night, a break from the stresses of work and school. The evening had started like any other. Laughter filled the rooms as they sprawled out on the living room floor, half drunk and bickering over which movie to watch first. The dim glow of the TV cast eerie, shifting shadows on the walls, making the old house feel even older than it already was. But the laughter quickly faded when the clock hit midnight, and the atmosphere began to change, subtle at first, but unsettling enough for Rachel to notice. Rachel was the host for the night, and though she was usually the life of the party, something about the house felt off tonight. She couldn't put her finger on it. Maybe it was the way the house creaked in the silence of the night, or the way the wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames. The old house had always been like that. A bit too quiet, a bit too heavy, but Rachel had grown used to it. She was fine with it. But tonight, the silence felt oppressive. The friends had grown quieter now, the mood shifting from lighthearted fun to something more tense, more introspective. Samantha, who always prided herself on being fearless, suddenly seemed agitated. She kept glancing around the room nervously, her eyes darting from the shadows that filled the corners of the room to the windows outside. Even Mark, who had always been the skeptic of the group, was visibly unsettled. He shifted uncomfortably on the couch, clearly trying to hide the fact that his hand was clenched tightly around his drink. Lily, who had been unusually quiet the entire evening, broke the silence. "Do you guys feel that?" she asked, her voice soft and almost distant. Everyone turned toward her, their eyes narrowing in curiosity. "Feel what?" Mark asked, a bit annoyed by her interruption. Lily didn't respond right away, instead looking around the room as if she was searching for something she couldn't see. "I don't know. I just have this weird feeling. Like we're not alone here." A brief silence passed as the others exchanged glances. "You're just tired," Samantha said with a forced laugh. "We've been watching scary movies all night. It's probably just messing with your head." But even as she said it, the tone in her voice seemed to falter. The house, which had always felt a bit eerie, now felt different. It wasn't just the old wood creaking beneath their feet or the wind howling outside. It was more than that. Something was wrong. Something unseen, something unspoken, was making the air feel thick, suffocating. Rachel felt it too. The weight of it, like an invisible presence that was growing stronger with each passing minute. She shifted uncomfortably, standing up and glancing toward the kitchen, hoping the movement would break the tension, but the feeling lingered. She could almost hear it, the low hum, the whisper, the things not said. "Okay, I'm starting to get freaked out," Lily muttered, her voice shaky now. "I keep hearing stuff, like whispers." "Whispers?" Samantha scoffed, trying to laugh it off. "You've got to be kidding me. It's probably just the wind." But Rachel wasn't so sure. She had heard it too. The whispers. Low, faint, barely audible. She thought it was the sound of the wind at first, but then she realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was coming from the walls, from somewhere deep within the house. A cold shiver ran down her spine. "Did you hear that?" Lily whispered again, her voice trembling. Everyone went silent, straining to listen. The air had grown colder. The shadows seemed deeper, more menacing. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere upstairs, followed by a series of heavy footsteps, as though something, or someone, was moving around in the attic. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. What the hell was that? Mark shot up from the couch. Probably just the house settling, he said, trying to sound confident, but his voice wavered slightly. It's an old place. You know how it is. But Rachel wasn't convinced. She had grown up in this house and she knew it well. The house had never made noises like that before, especially not in the middle of the night when everything was supposed to be silent. It was as if something, or someone, was moving around in the attic, something that didn't belong. I'll go check it out, Mark said, standing up and walking toward the stairs. But as soon as his foot hit the first step, the door to the living room slammed shut, locking with a loud, sickening click. Everyone froze. What the hell? Samantha whispered, backing away from the door. Rachel tried the handle, but it was locked. The air around them grew colder still, and the whispers grew louder, closer, now clearly audible in the dead silence. They were coming from behind the walls, from the dark, hidden places of the house. Guys! Lily whispered, her voice trembling. Something's wrong. We need to leave. No. But before anyone could react, the lights flickered. Twice. And then, the room plunged into darkness. The sound of the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the voices were closing in on them, surrounding them, trapping them in the darkness. The friends huddled together, their breaths shallow, eyes wide in terror. Rachel's mind raced. What was happening? What was this feeling? The coldness, the whispers, the sense that something was moving around them, unseen and unknown. It wasn't just the house settling anymore. This wasn't normal. Panic began to set in as they fumbled for their phones, trying to use the flashlight feature to illuminate the room. But their phones were dead. Completely drained. No matter how much they pressed the power buttons, nothing happened. Okay, this is freaking me out now, Samantha said, her voice cracking. What is going on? Why are the phones dead? The tension in the room was suffocating. They couldn't see anything. The only sounds now were the rapid beating of their hearts, the whispered voices, and the low creaks of the house, as if it was alive, as if it was breathing. And then, they heard something that made their blood run cold. A soft, slow knocking sound, coming from above them. The attic. The sound was steady, knock, knock, knock. And it wasn't stopping. Rachel's mind spun in a whirl of panic and disbelief. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. They had to be imagining things. There was no way. Something could be in the attic, something could be here. But the knocking continued, louder now, as if whatever it was trying to get their attention. A voice broke through the silence. Get out. It was faint at first, but clear enough for them to hear. A voice, deep and raspy, coming from somewhere near the wall. The room seemed to close in on them as the voice echoed through their bones. Get out. Rachel's heart raced. Her skin prickled. The whispering voices grew louder, and the knocking from the attic became more frantic, more violent. Please, Lily begged, her voice shaking. We need to leave. No. But the door was still locked. There was no way out. Rachel looked around at her friends, their faces pale with fear, eyes wide with terror. It was clear now, whatever was in this house was not going to let them leave. The fear, the whispers, the knocking, it was all a warning. The house was alive. And it wanted them to stay. The knocking continued, relentless, growing in intensity as if someone, or something, was desperately trying to break through. The walls seemed to pulse with every strike, as if the house itself was breathing, alive in a way that chilled the blood. Rachel's pulse raced as she stared at the door, her hands still gripped tightly around the cold, unyielding doorknob. She twisted and pulled, but it refused to budge, as if mocking her efforts, holding her in place like a prisoner in her own home. Mark stood beside her, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was a rational guy, always the one to dismiss superstitions or horror movie cliches. But this was different. Something was happening here, something beyond explanation. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, and his hands trembled as he reached for his phone, only to find it dead, the screen completely black. It wasn't the battery. He knew something wasn't right. What the hell's going on? Samantha whispered, her voice barely audible. She was huddled close to Lily, both of them staring at the door with a mix of terror and disbelief. Lily's lips quivered as she tried to speak, but no words came out. Instead, her eyes darted to the corners of the room, searching for anything that could explain the unnatural feeling that had settled over them like a thick fog. The whispers had faded slightly, but the pounding from above had only grown louder, more insistent, as if something was making its way down from the attic, step by step, coming closer with every second. Mark turned to Rachel, his voice tight with panic. What the hell was that voice? Did you hear it? It said, "Get out." Rachel nodded, swallowing hard. I heard it. But where did it come from? It wasn't from any of us. Maybe it's just our minds playing tricks on us, Samantha said, her words trembling. But even she couldn't keep the tremor of fear from her voice. It sounded hollow, as though she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. But Rachel knew better. This was no trick of the mind. She had felt it, this oppressive weight in the air, this suffocating presence that seemed to be getting closer, inch by inch. She turned her head to look at Lily, whose eyes were wide with terror, locked on the door with a 1,000-yard stare. There's no way out, Lily whispered, her voice cracking. Rachel's heart sank as she realized that Lily was right. They were trapped in this house, and whatever was in here with them wasn't going to let them go. She turned to the others, trying to keep her composure, but her hands were shaking, her legs unsteady. She felt the overwhelming urge to run, to escape, but every part of her screamed that there was no escaping this. Not anymore. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, causing the windows to rattle in their frames. It was as though the storm was feeding into the growing terror inside the house, a tempest both outside and in. The knocking from the attic had stopped, but a new sound took its place, a faint scraping noise, like something dragging across the floorboards above them. Slow, methodical, moving closer with each passing second. Samantha reached for her phone again, but it too remained dead. Her breathing quickened as she spun in place, looking for something, anything, that might help them get out. We need to find a way out. There has to be another door, another window, anything. Rachel's mind raced. She thought back to the house's layout, to every nook and cranny she knew so well. The attic, the basement, the bedrooms. They had been through every room in this house countless times, but now they all felt unfamiliar, foreign, as though the house had changed overnight. I don't know what's happening, Rachel muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. But we need to stick together. But even as she said it, Rachel knew something had already changed. The unity they'd once shared was starting to crack. There was a shift in the group dynamic, a creeping suspicion, a quiet fear, that one of them might be hiding something. Was someone responsible for this? Was someone playing a sick joke on them? No one would do this. The air was thick, heavy with dread, and Rachel could barely breathe as she moved away from the door, her eyes scanning the room for any escape route, any possible way out. The others followed suit, each of them looking for some way to escape, to break free from this nightmare that seemed to tighten its grip with every passing minute. And then the lights flickered. Twice. And then, darkness. Complete and utter darkness. A cold shiver ran down Rachel's spine as she instinctively reached out, trying to find the others in the pitch black. She could feel their presence, but she couldn't see them. She heard Samantha's muffled gasp, followed by a soft shuffle of footsteps as Lily stumbled backward. What the hell? Mark's voice cracked as he reached out blindly, searching for something, anything, to hold onto. His hand brushed against Rachel's arm, and she jumped at the unexpected touch. I can't see anything, Lily's voice trembled. What's going on? Rachel's mind spun. The house was alive, that much was certain. She could feel it, creeping around them, lurking in the shadows. The whispers were back, louder now, more insistent. And the pressure, she could feel it in her chest, in her bones. Something was watching them. Something that wasn't human. The floor creaked beneath their feet, and Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had heard it too. Someone was moving upstairs. Slowly. Methodically. Coming closer. Who's up there? Rachel whispered, but the words barely left her mouth before she heard the sound again. A soft, dragging noise. It was getting closer. What the hell is that? Mark whispered, his voice full of fear. It's not a person. It's not human. Rachel froze, feeling the blood drain from her face. She had been trying to ignore it, to push the fear to the back of her mind, but now it was undeniable. The house, no, something in the house, was moving. Without thinking, Rachel backed up against the wall, her breathing quick and shallow. She pressed her back against the cold wood, desperate to find something to hold on to, something to make the fear go away. But there was nothing. No escape. Then, just as suddenly as the darkness had fallen, a light flickered back on. But it wasn't the soft, comforting glow of their previous light. This light was harsh, flickering in rapid bursts, casting the room in sharp, jagged shadows. It seemed to move on its own, almost like a heartbeat. The whispers grew louder, now no longer whispers, but voices, clear, cold, distant voices, echoing through the walls, filling the room with their relentless demand, "Get out! Get out! Get out!" Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she spun around, searching for any sign of where the voices were coming from. Were they real? Were they just hallucinations? Was it all in her head? But before she could process anything further, a loud crash sounded from upstairs, followed by a series of footsteps, fast, urgent, as if someone was running down the stairs. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Something was coming. Something was coming down to them. And it wasn't human. It was something else. Something dark. Something alive. "Run," Lily breathed, her voice barely audible over the growing noise. And just as the last word escaped Lily's lips, the door to the living room rattled violently. Something was on the other side, pushing, pulling, trying to get in. Rachel's heart raced as she grabbed her friend's hands, pulling them away from the door, away from the noise. "Get to the basement," she urged, her voice strained with panic. But no one moved. The fear had paralyzed them. The knocking, the voices, the presence, it was all closing in, pulling them into the abyss. And they didn't know how much longer they could hold on. The group stood frozen in the dim, flickering light, each of them overwhelmed by the mounting terror that clawed at their minds. The once familiar living room now felt like a foreign place, dark, suffocating, and charged with an unnatural presence. Every creak of the house, every whispered sound, seemed to press in closer, as if the walls themselves were alive, watching, listening. The knocking from upstairs continued, louder now, its rhythmic beat echoing through the silence like a slow, deliberate countdown. It wasn't a random noise. It was purposeful, almost intentional, as if whatever was up there knew they were listening. Rachel's heart thudded in her chest, the pounding of her blood deafening in her ears. She could feel the cold sweat that had begun to trickle down her back, the sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. The chill in the air wasn't just from the wind outside. It was something else, something that seemed to seep in from the very walls, something that held the room in its grip. The air was thick with it, suffocating them, pressing in from all sides. "Who's doing this?" Mark's voice was barely above a whisper, his words shaky with fear. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone again, only to see it still dead. His breath came faster, panic beginning to set in as the realization that there was no escape slowly dawned on him. They were trapped. There was no way out. "Guys, we need to get out of here," Lily said, her voice quivering as she scanned the room, eyes darting from corner to corner. She could feel the presence, something that had settled in the space between them, something malevolent, pressing down on them. It was no longer just the strange noises and the whispers. There was something else in the house, something that wasn't human, something that didn't belong. Rachel's mind raced as she looked toward the stairs, her thoughts spinning. She knew this house, had grown up in it, had spent countless nights here with her friends, but now it was as if it had turned against them. The old house, the one that had always felt so welcoming, so familiar, now felt like a prison. A maze of shadows, corridors, and rooms that twisted and stretched beyond recognition. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It hung heavy in the air, thick with anticipation. The whispers had grown louder again, their words unintelligible, but their tone unmistakable, angry, desperate, pleading. They seemed to come from all directions, reverberating off the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Lily moved closer to Rachel, her body trembling with fear. I can't take this anymore, she said, her voice barely audible. I don't know what's happening, but I don't want to be here. I don't want to stay in this house. Samantha, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. You think I want to stay here? Are you kidding? We need to find a way out. We need to leave now. But Rachel knew. She knew that there was no leaving now. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go. The sense of dread that had been building since they arrived had now fully settled into her bones. It was suffocating. The house had closed in around them, trapping them in its grip. Suddenly, the air around them seemed to shift. It grew colder, a bone-deep cold that seemed to seep into their very souls. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the temperature dropped noticeably. It wasn't just the usual chill of the night. This was something deeper, something unnatural. The wind outside had died down, but the house felt as though it was getting colder by the second. What the hell is going on? Mark's voice was trembling now. He was no longer the skeptic, no longer the one who tried to rationalize everything. He had seen enough. He could feel it too. There was something in the house. Something that had been waiting for them. Rachel's eyes darted toward the staircase. The knocking had started again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the attic. It was coming from beneath them, from the floorboards, as if something was pounding from the very foundation of the house itself. The sound was so loud it rattled the walls. It was almost as if the house itself was trying to communicate with them. We need to get to the basement, Rachel said, her voice tight with fear. It was the only place they hadn't checked, the only place that might offer some sort of safety, if there was any safety to be found in this house. Now. Samantha looked at her, her eyes wide with panic. The basement? She asked, her voice high and strained. You want to go downstairs? Are you out of your mind? Rachel didn't answer. She didn't have the words to explain why. She didn't know why, but something about the basement felt important. Something in her gut told her that it was where they needed to go, that it was the last chance they had to survive. Lily hesitated, glancing between Rachel and the door, her breath coming faster. What if there's no way out down there either? What if we get trapped again? What if... We're already trapped, Mark cut in, his voice shaking. We're already trapped in this house. We need to stick together, or we're all gonna die here. Rachel turned to face him, her mind racing as she tried to come up with a plan, but nothing made sense. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, and the fear was clouding her judgment. She knew they needed to leave, but every time she tried to think of an escape, her mind hit a wall. The house wasn't going to let them go. The house wanted them here. The house needed them here. The air was growing thick, almost suffocating, and it felt as though the walls were closing in, pressing against them from every direction. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and shift, as though they were alive, reaching out toward them. Rachel felt her pulse pounding in her ears, and her breath quickened. The darkness felt like it was swallowing the room whole. Let's go, she finally said, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. We don't have time to argue. We need to move. They made their way toward the hallway, every step filled with uncertainty, each of them reluctant to move forward. The basement door was just a few steps away, but the journey there felt like an eternity. The floor creaked under their feet, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. The whispers grew louder again, the voices now indistinct but undeniably angry, as if the house itself was warning them to stay away. Lily reached out, grabbing Rachel's arm. We shouldn't be doing this. We don't know what's down there. But Rachel shook her head. We don't have a choice. We have to try. They reached the basement door, and Rachel turned the knob. It opened with a groan, the hinges protesting as if they hadn't been moved in years. The darkness on the other side of the door seemed to swallow the light, and for a moment, Rachel hesitated. The air down there felt colder still, the smell of dust and mildew thick in her nostrils. Go, Rachel urged, stepping back so the others could enter first. She followed close behind, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the weight of the darkness pressing down on them. As they descended the stairs, the temperature dropped even further. The darkness seemed to thicken, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. The only sound now was the rhythmic creaking of the house, the low hum of something unseen moving through the walls. And then, just as they reached the bottom of the stairs, the door slammed shut behind them. They were no longer in control. The house had them now. They were trapped, and they had nowhere to run. The basement was darker than Rachel had anticipated. The moment they stepped inside, the air seemed to thicken, as if the house had consumed their very breath. The temperature had dropped even further, and the cold seeped through their clothes, settling deep into their bones. Rachel could hear her own breath, shallow, ragged, as if the air itself was pressing against her chest. Every step she took echoed in the suffocating silence, and the heavy scent of dust and mildew filled her nostrils. It was as though the basement hadn't been disturbed in years, maybe even decades. The walls, covered in old, peeling wallpaper, looked as though they were closing in, the darkness in the corners of the room twisting like shadows that were waiting to grab hold of them. Mark stepped forward, his flashlight shaking in his hands, casting a weak beam of light that barely cut through the oppressive blackness. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but he tried to maintain control, trying to act like the rational one in a situation that had long stopped making sense. "We shouldn't be down here," he muttered, his voice thin and trembling. "This is a bad idea. We need to get out of here now." But his words were hollow, nothing more than an attempt to convince himself that there was still some escape, some way to outrun whatever was happening in the house. Rachel felt the weight of his words, but there was no turning back now. They were already too far in, the oppressive force of the house pushing them deeper into the unknown. She glanced at the others, Samantha, her face drawn with fear, her hands pressed tightly against her chest as if trying to hold herself together, Lily, who was clutching Rachel's sleeve with a grip so tight it hurt, her eyes darting around the darkened room as if she could see something they couldn't. Everyone was on edge, but the fear in their eyes spoke volumes. They were trapped and they knew it. The whispering had started again. Soft at first, like a distant murmur that seemed to come from the walls, but gradually, it grew louder, more insistent. The voices were indistinct at first, just a jumble of words that didn't make sense. But then one word broke through the chaos: "Stay." It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable in its intent. Rachel's blood ran cold. The word wasn't a plea, it was a command, a directive that seemed to pulse through the very air around them, vibrating in her chest. "Stay." She felt it reverberate deep within her, like the house itself was speaking to her, trying to anchor her here, trying to make her part of whatever was festering in the darkness. Lily gasped and pulled away from Rachel's side, her eyes wide with terror. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please tell me you heard that." Rachel nodded slowly, her throat dry, her heart pounding with every beat. She hadn't imagined it. The voice was real. It wasn't just in her head. Whatever it was, whatever force was lurking in the depths of the house, it was trying to get them to stay. To keep them trapped here. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, and Rachel could feel the floor beneath her feet shifting slightly, as though the house was alive, shifting and moving around them. The floor creaked under her weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "Stay here," Samantha muttered, her voice shaky. She looked up at the others, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "That voice, it's not just in our heads, right? I mean, we all heard it, didn't we?" There was a pause as the group exchanged glances, each of them silently acknowledging that yes, they had all heard it. But none of them spoke the words aloud. They didn't need to. The fear in their eyes was enough. The thing in the house wasn't playing games anymore. Whatever it was real, and it was trying to keep them here. Rachel's stomach twisted with dread. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on them, like an invisible hand gripping their throats, choking the air from their lungs. She glanced at the basement door, her mind racing. It was still closed behind them, but it felt as though it was locked, sealed shut by something much stronger than a mere door. Even if they could force it open, she wasn't sure they would make it. Whatever was in this house wasn't going to let them leave. "I think we should move," Rachel said, her voice hoarse. She couldn't explain why, but something deep inside her told her that staying in one place was a mistake. It felt like they were being slowly drawn into the basement, like the house was slowly swallowing them whole. She didn't want to stay in this place for a second longer than she had to. "We need to find another way out. This This basement, there's something about it. It doesn't feel right. Samantha's eyes flicked nervously toward the darkened corners of the room. What do you mean, find another way out? The whole house is wrong. It's all wrong. Rachel took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she adjusted her grip on the flashlight. She had no answers. She didn't even know what they were looking for anymore. She just knew they couldn't stay here. They had to keep moving. They had to find a way to break free. I don't know what's happening, she whispered, her voice cracking. But we can't just stand here. We need to find something, anything that can help us. We can't stay in this room. With a steadying breath, Rachel moved forward, her legs weak beneath her as she stepped deeper into the basement. The others hesitated at first, but then, one by one, they followed her, each of them taking tentative steps into the darkness. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but it wasn't just the walls now. The air itself seemed to hum with the voices, as though the house itself was vibrating with the energy of the unseen force that inhabited it. The light from the flashlight flickered in and out, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. Each flicker made the room feel more alive, as if the shadows were moving, creeping along the walls, following them, closing in. Rachel could hear the soft scrape of her shoes against the concrete floor, the sound harsh and intrusive in the eerie silence. The basement seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in tighter with every step they took. They passed a series of old wooden crates, long abandoned, their surfaces covered in dust. The air smelled stale, musty, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. Suddenly, the flashlight's beam landed on something large and dark in the far corner of the basement. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she stepped closer, the others following her, each of them cautiously stepping into the beam of light. It was a large, old cabinet, its doors closed tight, its surface covered in the same thick dust as the rest of the room. But there was something strange about it, something that made the hair on the back of Rachel's neck stand up. Do you think it's hiding something? Mark's voice was barely a whisper, his tone fearful. Rachel didn't answer. She reached forward, her hand trembling as she gripped the cold metal handle of the cabinet. It didn't move at first, and for a moment, she thought it was locked. But then, with a low groan, the doors creaked open, revealing only darkness beyond. Her heart raced. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, maybe a stash of old clothes or something mundane, but what she saw made her blood run cold. Inside the cabinet was a small, wooden box. It was old, its surface scratched and worn, as though it had been handled many times before. But it wasn't the box itself that caught her attention. It was what was inside the box. A set of old photographs. The photos were yellowed with age, their edges curled and fragile. Rachel picked one up, her hands shaking as she held it up to the light. The faces in the photo were barely visible, distorted by time. But the moment she looked at them, she felt a chill race down her spine. The people in the photo, there was something wrong with them. Their eyes were empty, hollow, like they had been drained of life. And then it hit her. These were old photos of her own family. Photos from when she was a child. Her breath caught in her throat. The faces were all familiar, her parents, her siblings, even her old dog. But there was one thing missing from each photograph. One thing that made her stomach churn with a sudden, overwhelming fear. Her family wasn't smiling in these photos. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes hollow and dark. And there was something else. In the background of each photo, just barely visible, was a figure. A tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes, standing just out of focus. Who the hell are these people? Mark's voice cracked, but Rachel couldn't answer. Her hands shook so violently she almost dropped the photo. Suddenly, she heard the whispers again, louder now, rising in volume, overlapping each other. Get out. Don't leave. The voice from the walls, the house, it was here. And it wasn't just calling them to stay. It was calling them to become part of it. To join it in the dark, to disappear. To be swallowed whole by whatever ancient force. Rachel's heart raced as she held the photograph in her trembling hands. The faces of her family stared back at her, their hollow eyes locked onto her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. She felt as though she had been transported back to her childhood, back to a time when everything in this house seemed so familiar, so safe. But now, everything was wrong. The faces in the photo were twisted, their smiles absent, replaced with an unsettling emptiness. The figure lurking in the background, the shadowy form with glowing eyes, was no longer a faint detail. It was clearer now, its presence undeniable. Something dark, something malevolent, had been watching them all along. Rachel? Mark's voice broke through the suffocating silence, shaky and unsure. He had stepped closer, peering over her shoulder at the photo. His eyes widened as he saw what she was seeing. What the hell is that? What's going on? Rachel couldn't speak. The air around her seemed to press down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her mind spun, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She had grown up in this house. She had played in this basement as a child, explored every corner, every nook and cranny. But now, nothing seemed familiar. The house felt foreign, hostile, as though it had changed in some fundamental way. It wasn't the place she remembered. "Rachel, what is it?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper. She was standing behind her now, her eyes wide with fear as she peered over Rachel's shoulder. The others had gathered around, each of them frozen in place, staring at the photograph. It's my family," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with dread. "But something's wrong. They don't look like this in any of the other pictures I have. And look at the figure in the back. It's like it's following us, like it's been here all along." Samantha's eyes darted nervously between the photo and Rachel's face. This doesn't make sense. How could that figure be in the photo? We never saw anything like that before. Rachel's head spun. She felt dizzy, disconnected from the moment, like she was caught in a waking nightmare. Her fingers clutched the photo tighter, but the more she stared at it, the more the faces seemed to twist, to distort. The hollow eyes seemed to follow her every movement, and the shadowy figure in the background seemed to shift, its glowing eyes growing brighter with each passing second. The air felt thick, suffocating. The whispers from the walls had intensified, their voices now indistinct, rising in a maddening crescendo, like a chorus of unseen, malevolent forces closing in around them. Then, with a sudden jolt, the basement light flickered, casting erratic, sharp shadows across the room. The air around them grew even colder, and Rachel felt a shiver run through her entire body. She turned to look behind her, certain she had heard something, footsteps or maybe a whisper, but there was nothing there. Just the thick, oppressive darkness. The silence was almost deafening. Mark's voice broke through the tension. "This is insane. This is all some kind of sick joke, right? There's no way this is real." Rachel shook her head, her throat tight with fear. "No, Mark. This isn't a joke. We're not imagining this. The house, She paused, unable to put her thoughts into words, her mind struggling to make sense of the terror that was slowly engulfing them. "It's not just a house anymore. It's alive. And it's trying to keep us here." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their meaning. The house was alive, and it had been watching them all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. Rachel's breath came in ragged gasps as she looked around the room, her gaze moving from the flickering light to the shadowy corners of the basement, where the darkness seemed to grow deeper with every passing second. "What do we do now?" Lily asked, her voice barely more than a breath. She was holding on to Rachel's arm now, her grip tight, almost painful. "How do we get out of here?" Rachel didn't have an answer. She couldn't think. The weight of the situation, the suffocating fear that gripped her heart, made it impossible to form a coherent thought. She had no idea what they were supposed to do. The basement door, was still shut behind them, locked, and the house itself seemed to be closing in on them. They were trapped. No matter how hard she tried to rationalize it, there was no escape. There was no way out. "I don't know," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what we're supposed to do." Samantha stepped forward, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to get out. We have to find a way out. We can't stay here. Not like this." But it was too late for that. They had already crossed the point of no return. Whatever had started in the house, whatever dark force had been lurking just beneath the surface, was fully awake now. and it wasn't going to let them leave. The whispers grew louder, now distinct, their voices unmistakable. Stay with us. Forever. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the house, feel its presence pressing against her, like a physical force. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. It was the very air around them, thick with the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting. The house wasn't just alive. It was aware. And it wanted them. It wanted them to stay. No, Rachel whispered, stepping back, her legs shaking beneath her. We can't stay. We won't stay. But the house didn't care. The walls around them seemed to groan, the floor beneath them creaking and shifting, as though it was alive, moving. The temperature dropped again, and Rachel's breath came out in visible clouds, her hands trembling as she tried to hold onto the flashlight to keep it steady. The darkness seemed to press in closer, suffocating them. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the walls, twisting and warping in unnatural shapes. The basement was no longer just a room. It was something else entirely, something that had swallowed them whole. Stay with us, the voices whispered again, louder now, their tone more insistent, more forceful. You can't leave. You belong here. Forever. Lily screamed, her voice piercing the suffocating air. No. Get away from us. But there was nowhere to run. No place to hide. The house had them now. And it wasn't going to let them go. The walls seemed to close in around them, the space shrinking with each passing second. The light flickered once more, and then, nothing. Darkness. In the pitch black, Rachel could hear the others' panicked breaths, their uneven footsteps as they stumbled around in the dark. But she couldn't see them. Couldn't see anything. The air was thick with dread, heavy with the weight of something old, ancient, and far more terrifying than anything they had imagined. The whispers were now all around them, the voices becoming clearer, more forceful, almost frantic. Stay. Rachel's throat tightened as the air seemed to choke her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. It was as though the very essence of the house had seeped into her, into all of them, wrapping itself around their hearts, their minds, their souls. There was no escape. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, more suffocating than any noise could have been. For a brief moment, there was no sound, no movement. It was as if time itself had frozen. But then the scraping began. Soft at first, a faint sound that barely registered above the pounding of Rachel's heart. But it grew louder, closer. A slow, deliberate dragging sound. Something, or someone, was coming closer. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was. The thing in the darkness, the one that had been waiting for them all along, was finally making its move. And it wasn't going to stop until they were part of the house. Part of it. She turned, her legs unsteady, her body shaking with fear. There was no way out, no way to escape. The house had won. The scraping sound grew louder, more distinct, like nails dragging across wood, but it wasn't just coming from one direction. It was everywhere, reverberating from the walls, the ceiling, and even beneath their feet. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a deafening drum in the suffocating silence that surrounded them. She couldn't tell if it was the house itself making the noise, or if something was moving through the shadows, slowly advancing toward them. She could hear the others breathing, but it sounded distant, muffled, as if they, too, were slowly being consumed by the darkness. Is it coming from the walls? Samantha's voice cracked, barely a whisper. She was standing beside Rachel, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. Her body trembled with each scraping noise, every movement around them making her flinch as though expecting something to reach out from the shadows and grab hold of her. I don't know, Rachel managed to breathe, her throat dry. She looked around frantically, but all she saw were shifting shadows, each one taking on a life of its own. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the temperature seemed to drop even further, as if the house was literally draining the warmth from their bodies. Every breath felt like it could be their last, their lungs struggling against the weight of the suffocating fear that surrounded them. Mark stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the light switch. But before he could make contact, the lights flickered again, and then, to their horror, went out entirely. The basement was plunged into darkness once more, deeper, darker, more oppressive than ever. The scraping intensified, closer now, unmistakably moving toward them. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the silence that followed felt like an eternity, stretching and twisting around them. She felt a sudden, sharp tug at her sleeve. Lily. The terrified look on her face mirrored Rachel's own feelings: fear, confusion, a sense of helplessness. Lily's eyes were wide, darting around the room, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just shadows. Just the feeling of something watching, waiting. The air became heavier, almost solid, as if they were walking through a fog thick with dread. Rachel's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan, trying to make sense of the madness that surrounded them. But there was no plan. There was no way out. Not anymore. The house had them. They were trapped, bound to it, its ancient presence creeping into their very souls. Another scraping sound echoed through the room, louder now, as though something, or someone, was moving toward them with purpose. The sound was almost rhythmic now, methodical, like a slow and deliberate march. Rachel's breath quickened, her pulse hammering in her ears as she looked around desperately. She could see nothing, but the feeling of being surrounded was unmistakable. Whatever was out there, it was coming closer. "Stay together," Rachel managed to say, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. She reached out, taking Lily's hand, then Mark's, pulling them closer, trying to keep them united, trying to make sure no one wandered off into the darkness. But it was hard. The darkness felt like it had a life of its own, stretching out, pulling them apart. Suddenly, there was a loud bang from above them, followed by a heavy thud. The sound reverberated through the floor, shaking the walls and making the air tremble. It felt like the house was shaking, as though it were alive, convulsing in a fit of rage. Rachel stumbled back, her body slamming into the cold concrete wall behind her as the floor beneath them groaned. For a moment, everything went silent, but then, the scraping began again. Louder, closer, more urgent. "What the hell was that?" Samantha whispered, her voice laced with panic. She was pressed up against Rachel now, her body trembling. "What is it? What's coming?" Rachel couldn't answer. Her mind was blank, the terror in her chest choking off any coherent thoughts. She could feel her fingers shaking, the sweat pouring down her back despite the freezing temperature in the room. The house was pressing in on them, each second dragging them deeper into its grasp. Whatever it wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to let them go. Then the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel stood there, holding her breath, waiting for the next sound, the next movement, but there was nothing. Just silence. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting, watching. And then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. At first, it was barely visible, just a shape, a shadow that flickered in and out of existence. But as it came closer, Rachel could see it more clearly. A tall, thin figure, draped in shadow, its outline jagged and unnatural. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its form shifting, its edges blurring as if it wasn't fully there. It was like watching a nightmare manifest in front of her, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. There was something wrong with its face. Its features were distorted, warped, like they had been melted, twisted into something inhuman. It moved with purpose, its eyes locked onto Rachel's, its gaze cold, unblinking. It wasn't just watching them. It was hunting them. Samantha gasped, stumbling backward. "What the hell is that?" she cried, her voice trembling with fear. But there was no answer. The figure continued to advance, its form flickering in and out of existence, as if it was struggling to maintain its shape. The air around it shimmered, like heat rising off pavement, distorting the space around it. Lily's grip tightened on Rachel's arm, her nails digging into her skin as she whispered, "Please, make it stop. Please, Rachel." But Rachel couldn't move. She was frozen, rooted to the spot by the figure's gaze, by the unearthly presence that seemed to emanate from it. The figure's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, its teeth sharp and elongated, glinting in the dim light. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out, just a deep, resonant hum, like the vibration of a tuning fork. The floor beneath them groaned again, this time louder, the sound reverberating through the room. Rachel could feel the walls pressing in on them, the air thick with the weight of the house's malevolent force. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. Every inch of her being screamed to get away, to flee, but the house, the figure, the darkness, none of it would allow her to escape. And then, as if on cue, the figure lunged. The movement was so sudden, so fast, that Rachel didn't even have time to react. It was on them in an instant, its long, bony arms reaching out, grasping, pulling them toward it. Lily screamed, her voice high and filled with terror as the figure's hands clamped around her arm, pulling her into the darkness. "No!" Rachel shouted, finally able to move. She reached out, grabbing Lily's hand, pulling with all her strength. But the figure's grip was unyielding, its fingers digging into Lily's skin like iron, pulling her away, dragging her into the suffocating blackness. Mark screamed, running forward to try and pull Lily free, but the figure was too strong. It wasn't just pulling her. It was consuming her, dragging her into the shadow itself, as if the darkness was swallowing her whole. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and Rachel felt her stomach turn as she fought against the growing panic in her chest. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, followed by a series of horrific noises, bones snapping, skin tearing, followed by an eerie silence. Lily was gone. Rachel stood frozen in the aftermath, the air thick with the silence that had followed Lily's disappearance. The darkness around them seemed to grow heavier, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. Her pulse raced, her breath shallow, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Lily, her best friend, had been pulled into the shadows, her screams still echoing in Rachel's mind. The figure had taken her with such ease, so effortlessly, that it was almost as if she had never been there at all. The noise, the violent movement, Rachel could still hear it in her mind, a horrible, disjointed memory that would never fade. Mark was still standing there, his body tense, his face pale with shock. He had tried to help, had reached out, but it had been too late. Lily was gone. Gone into the black void that seemed to haunt every corner of this house. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in rapid succession, as if trying to catch up with what had just happened, but no amount of air seemed enough to fill the void of his panic. "Lily!" Mark whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking under the weight of grief and disbelief. His eyes were wide, scanning the space where she had been just moments before, hoping, praying that somehow she would return, that it had all been some sort of cruel trick. But there was nothing. Only the shadows, stretching and curling in unnatural ways, as though the very fabric of the basement itself had come alive in her absence. Rachel's stomach twisted in knots, her hands shaking violently as she reached for Mark, grabbing his arm. "We have to go. We have to get out of here now." But Mark wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the spot where Lily had been taken, his body frozen, as though he couldn't move. Rachel's heart ached for him. She could see the devastation in his eyes. The helplessness. They had all been in this together, but now, the group was splintering. Lily was gone, and they were alone in this suffocating, nightmare-infested house. "Mark, please," Rachel pleaded, her voice desperate as she tried to snap him out of his stupor. "She's gone. We can't stay here. We need to get out before it's too late for us too." The words barely seemed to register with him. His face was blank, his eyes staring into nothingness, as though he couldn't comprehend what had happened. It wasn't that he didn't understand, he couldn't. How could anyone understand something so horrifying, so impossible? Lily hadn't just disappeared. She had been taken by something. Something that existed in the dark, in the places where light couldn't reach, something that was beyond their comprehension. Rachel's mind was racing, her thoughts a chaotic jumble. The house had shown its true nature now. It wasn't just some old, haunted place. It was alive. And it was feeding on their fear, on their grief, on their despair. It had consumed Lily, and it wasn't going to stop until it had consumed them all. She grabbed Mark harder, shaking him, willing him to snap out of it. "Mark, look at me. We need to go. We have to leave." His head jerked up suddenly, as though her words had cut through the haze of shock surrounding him. His eyes were wide, still full of terror, but now they were focused on her, as if he was just beginning to understand what was happening. His lips trembled as he spoke. "What are we going to do, Rachel? What the hell are we supposed to do?" Rachel's mind was a blur, but one thing was clear: they couldn't stay in the basement. They couldn't stay anywhere in this house. The house was alive, and it was hunting them, just as it had hunted Lily. There was no way out, no escape, except to leave the house. But even that seemed impossible. The door was sealed, and the walls, the very house itself, felt like they were closing in around them. Rachel's hands gripped Mark's arms tighter. "We fight," she said, her voice a mixture of fear and resolve. "We fight and we run. We can't stay here. We can't give up." Mark blinked at her, his expression slowly changing from terror to something else, a flicker of determination. She could see it in his eyes, the glimmer of fight, of survival. He nodded slowly, his body still trembling, but at least now he was standing with her, ready to face whatever came next. The darkness around them seemed to pulse, the air thick with an almost tangible malevolence. The silence was unbearable, like the calm before a storm. Rachel's eyes darted nervously to the basement stairs, half expecting something, or someone, to appear at any moment, to emerge from the shadows and drag them into the depths. But there was nothing. Just silence. The oppressive silence that seemed to scream at them to stay. Rachel stepped forward, her legs shaky but determined. She couldn't wait. They couldn't wait. Every second spent here in this place was a second too long. They had to move. Mark followed, his movement stiff, his face still pale but now set with the same resolve. "Where do we go?" "Well, now." Rachel didn't have an answer. She couldn't think clearly. She could only feel the pull of the house, the way it seemed to wrap around her like a heavy fog, clouding her thoughts, choking her clarity. But she couldn't let that stop her. They needed to get out, to find a way to escape. They moved toward the stairs, but as Rachel reached the bottom step, a loud, guttural sound echoed from above, a low, deep growl that seemed to come from the very walls. The house rumbled in response, the air vibrating with an eerie hum that made her skin crawl. It was like the house was alive, like it was reacting to their movement, sensing their desire to leave. Suddenly, the light above them flickered, then went out completely. The darkness in the basement grew even more oppressive, more suffocating. Rachel's pulse quickened, her heart hammering in her chest as she gripped Mark's hand harder. She could feel him trembling beside her. The darkness was closing in, and it felt like it was going to swallow them whole. "We're not getting out," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's too late. We can't escape." Rachel shook her head, refusing to accept it. "We can't give up. We can't just lie down and let it take us." Her voice shook with the force of her words, but there was something inside her, something deep, a spark of hope that refused to die, even in the face of everything they were up against. The growl came again, this time louder, more intense. It wasn't just a sound. It was a warning, the threat. Rachel's eyes darted around the room, scanning for anything, any way out. But the basement was just as it had always been. No windows, no exit, just a dark, hollow space that stretched on endlessly. The walls felt like they were closing in on them, pressing in tighter with each passing moment. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a faint glimmer of light. It was weak, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A sliver of hope. The door. The basement door that had been sealed before. It was ajar, just a crack, barely noticeable in the dark. Without thinking, Rachel grabbed Mark's arm and yanked him toward it. "This way," she whispered urgently. "We have to get out." "No." Mark hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the stairs where the growling had originated, but then he followed her. He didn't question it. He couldn't afford to. They stumbled toward the door, each step like a battle, their feet heavy with dread, their breaths shallow and quick. The growl was getting closer now, the sound reverberating off the walls, shaking the very foundation of the house. The door was so close, but it felt like an eternity away. When they reached it, Rachel's heart nearly stopped as she grabbed the handle. It was cold to the touch, almost unbearably so. She pulled. The door creaked, groaned, but it didn't budge. It was stuck. The house wasn't letting them go. The house didn't want them to leave. She pulled again with all her strength, but the door refused to open. And then, with a deep, rumbling growl, the shadows around them stirred. They were no longer alone. The growl intensified, vibrating through the walls and floor like a deep, guttural roar from the depths of the earth. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, the frantic thudding of it drowning out everything else. The darkness in the basement felt alive now, a living, breathing entity, suffocating her with its presence. She pulled harder on the door, her hands slick with sweat, her breath ragged, her thoughts spinning out of control. Mark stood beside her, equally desperate, tugging at the handle with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, sealed, as if the house itself was refusing to let them escape. The growl came again, closer now, almost on top of them, a horrific sound that made her skin crawl. Rachel's hands shook as she let go of the handle for just a moment, her fingers trembling with the weight of her fear. She glanced toward the stairwell, and her breath hitched in her throat. Something was coming down the stairs, moving with purpose, its steps heavy and slow, but deliberate. The figure was almost here. The darkness at the top of the stairs seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, the shadows shifting like they were alive, crawling down toward them, stretching long and lean like a predator on the hunt. "Mark," she gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. She didn't have to say more. The look in her eyes said everything. They needed to get out. Mark's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but there was a fire in his gaze now, a recognition of the dire situation they were in. The weight of the house's suffocating presence was too much to bear, but neither of them was willing to die here. Not without a fight. He stepped back, kicking the door with his foot in a desperate attempt to force it open, but it didn't budge. His foot collided with the door with a thud that reverberated through the space, but the door remained steadfast, unyielding, as though it had become part of the house itself. "We need to think. We can't just—" Mark began, but his words were cut off by the deafening growl that filled the room again, louder this time, accompanied by a shifting sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. Rachel's blood ran cold as she glanced over her shoulder. The shadows were moving. The thing on the stairs was getting closer. Rachel's mind raced, searching for anything that might give them a way out. The house had locked them in. It was as if the walls were closing in on them, the air becoming thicker, heavier with each passing second. There was no way forward, no way back. And now, something, or someone, was stalking them from the shadows, drawing closer with every breath. Mark grabbed her arm, his grip tight, pulling her closer to him. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke, the words heavy with fear. "We can't let it take us. We can't stay here." Rachel nodded, her mind spinning. She couldn't argue with that. The English whatever it was coming for them, and she had no intention of becoming its next victim. They needed to act. They needed a plan, anything. "We need a weapon," she whispered urgently, her eyes darting around the room, desperately searching for anything they could use. But the basement was bare, save for a few scattered old crates, an ancient furnace in the corner, and shelves filled with forgotten, long-abandoned odds and ends. Nothing useful. Nothing that could fight off the nightmare closing in on them. The growl came again, sharper this time, closer. A twisted, raspy sound, like the breath of something that had not breathed in centuries. Rachel's stomach churned, her throat tightening as she fought the urge to scream. The thing was almost here. Mark's eyes scanned the room too, his face pale, his eyes wild. "There's nothing," he said, his voice almost defeated. "There's nothing here to help us. He was cut off by the sudden crash of something heavy falling to the floor above them. It was a loud, echoing sound that shook the walls and rattled the shelves. The entire house seemed to groan, like it was alive in the worst possible way. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Whatever was coming for them had just moved closer. "Come on," she shouted, grabbing Mark's hand and pulling him with her. She didn't know where they were going, but they couldn't stand here. They couldn't just wait for whatever was stalking them to finish them off. They had to fight back. They had to survive. They stumbled toward the back of the basement, their feet slipping on the slick, cold concrete floor as the growl came again, louder, more insistent. It was right behind them now, the thing on the stairs, moving with unnatural speed. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she heard the unmistakable sound of someone, scraping against the walls, dragging itself down the stairs. The sound was like nails against glass, grating and horrible, sending a jolt of pure fear straight into her chest. They reached the far wall, their backs pressed against it, as the sound of the dragging feet grew louder. It was coming. The thing was almost upon them, and they had nowhere to go. "Shit," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible, but the panic was clear in his eyes. He looked back at the door, but there was no hope in his gaze. It was still sealed shut, locked in place by the house itself, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Rachel could feel the thing now, feel its presence just beyond the wall. She could feel its eyes on her, even though she couldn't see it. The air was thick with dread, the weight of something ancient and terrifying closing in. It was only a matter of time before it found them. But she wasn't ready to die. She wouldn't let this thing take her, take Mark, take anyone else. Not without a fight.